So for this evening, to discuss the topic of Brexit and its consequences, we're delighted to be joined again, welcoming back, Dr. Rémy Davison. Rémy is Jean Monnet Chair in Politics and Economics at Monash University. He was appointed a global expert by the UN in 2010 due to his expertise in the EU, and he is a prolific author. So I will now hand over to Rémy and go from there. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Alistair. And thank you very much too to both the AIIA Victorian and Tasmanian branches. So I'd just like to thank Ian Baxter, Kim Boyer and Peter Boyce at AIIA Tasmania, and also Alistair, of course, for organising the Victorian end and agreeing to host, because Tasmania wasn't able to host this in the end online. So the AIIA Victoria stepped in to the breach like Olivier in John Gielgud's Romeo and Juliet. And that was in 1935, so I don't expect anybody to have seen that production necessarily. Nevertheless, speaking of two lovers who have died, I should probably end the analogy here because I think that's probably dying as well. But I might just commence with a story which actually came out over the weekend, where it was reported that the Spanish government is preparing to eject at least 500 Britons in the first instance who have not been granted residency status in Spain as of March 31st. If you haven't gone through the official process in Spain of obtaining residency status, you must leave or you will be deemed an illegal immigrant on the 1st of April, and that's not an April Fool's joke. They interviewed one gentleman, Sean Cromer, who has lived in Costa del Sol for 5 years. He voted for Britain to leave the EU in the 2016 referendum. Mr. Cromer was quoted as saying, "Yes, I voted out, but I didn't realise it would affect our Spanish lifestyle." So when we speak of the consequences of Brexit, the effects are indeed widespread, not merely for the UK, but for the EU, as well as their major partners in North America, Asia, and of course, Australia and New Zealand. So I might just, will I get into slide mode here?
Yeah, let's just bear with me while we do the screen share. We'll get there in a second.
Thanks, that's good. Yep, that's fine. Thank you. Yes, all good.
Then you can work off that.
Now, as some Tasmanian members might recall, we talked about this, about Brexit in July 2019, and when I left Hobart in July 2019, we were here. In December 2019, Professor Bruce Wilson at RMIT and myself gave another paper on this topic. We were invited by the Athenaeum, and I don't think we'll be invited back. Indeed, we were heckled at one point, which might be the first time this has happened to me in quite some time, although it might happen tonight, so we'll see about that. So let me give you a bit of an introduction to what's been happening. So where we ended up when Britain formally signed up for a deal and left the European Union following its transition period on 31st of December last year. And again, a bit of background, because we need to know what we're talking about. The European single market, most of us will be familiar with. So 28 countries, 27 now with Britain gone, and the single market comprises 4 freedoms: the freedom of movement of goods, of services, of labour, and of capital. And there are a few extra European countries that aren't members of the EU, but nevertheless a part of the single market: Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, under the European Economic Area Agreement. And of course, the EU has lost access as a result of leaving the EU formally at the end of last year. So there was a Withdrawal Agreement Act, which Theresa May had prepared as long ago as 2017, which finally came into being once the UK left the European Union. And I'm obviously not covering everything here, but there's a few things that we need to be aware of: the financial liabilities, the citizens' rights, and the Ireland-UK border, which, as you'll be aware, is still an issue at present. So the famous Boris Johnson line, they can go whistle if they want £39 billion, but in the end, that's effectively what Britain's paid. Britain's left the EU late, so it's already paid its dues for 2018, 2019. So this shows you how much is left to pay up through 2064. So there'll still be liabilities, but it's anyway, it's less than what they'd be paying as members, obviously. Citizens' rights, migration, residency, work rights. We've already heard a little bit about that. And under an agreement struck in 2019, Northern Ireland remains under EU rules. So no more border, no actual physical border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, only routine domestic trade transactions are concerned. I might talk a little bit more about this later. Actually, I'll talk about it now since it's in my next slide. You can see how far I read ahead. I should have read even brighter more, shouldn't I? Anyway, so a key provision of the Withdrawal Agreement Act, as it's called, it leaves Northern Ireland within the UK customs area, and there will be a vote on that. Ultimately, in 2022, Stormont will decide whether it wants to remain within this customs area. It's under EU rules and checks as well. The third agreement relates to the free trade agreement between the EU and UK. So this again was something which came into force at the beginning of this year. It was finalized just before Christmas last year, but, and this gets interesting, doesn't it? It has not yet been ratified by the European Parliament, which it needs to be. It's already been passed through the House of Commons, House of Lords, no problem there. Only, I think, 73 members of the Commons voted against it, but the EP has delayed ratification because there are concerns about the application of the rule of law by the British government in relation to Northern Ireland. The fourth aspect refers to the level playing field or regulatory convergence between the EU and the UK. Now, the document, of course, which outlines the free trade agreement is nearly 1,500 pages in English, and I very much doubt there's anybody living who's, or dead for that matter, who's read the entire thing from beginning to end. So I teach political economy, so I tend to focus on the economic aspects. So hopefully if economics bores you, I'll only bore you for about 35 more minutes. Let's have a look at it quickly though, and distill it into the most important components. So in the free trade agreement between the UK and EU, zero tariffs on goods. It is a goods agreement, a free trade in goods agreement. There are no quotas, so the EU cannot limit, and Britain cannot limit, how many cars, buses, trucks, microchips, television sets that move to and from the EU and the UK. There are, however, as most free trade agreements have, a rules of origin agreement, and this generally means that to qualify as a European product, when Britain exports to the EU, for example, it must contain at least 50% European content. So that can mean British and EU content, but not third-party content. All right, otherwise it attracts a tariff, and we all know what that means. So this applies to re-exportation. Now, some interesting little examples I just pulled out of the ether. 20% of dairy can be non-UK origin. So this is a rule. Yes, that's right. So if you're lactose intolerant, you probably don't have a problem because you're not even going to be consuming any dairy. But 40% of white chocolate can be non-EU. So you can source your cocoa beans from somewhere else. It's 40% of the white chocolate. Okay. Now, Oxford Economics, which is one of many firms which has done a study of Brexit and the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, found that in every single industry sector that they modelled, that both the UK and EU would suffer negative effects. So the Romeo and Juliet effect, if you like. So if, on the other hand, there had been no deal, then they would have defaulted to World Trade Organization tariffs. And here's what one study by Deloitte found that there would have been 16,000 job losses in German automotive had there been no deal, and 770,000 fewer cars would have been sold in both the UK and EU over a certain time period, and this would have resulted overall in a 20 billion euro loss to the UK EU automotive industry. So that's just one example of what no deal might have looked at. Now, the interesting thing about the Oxford study is, of course, everybody gets hurt by Brexit. Everybody gets hurt, but British companies get hurt more. So the industry losses modeled by Oxford were that there were 3 times, 4 times, or 5 times multiples of the losses of those of EU industries. So short-term consequences. Well, we saw that even prior to COVID, there were, and I'll talk about these more in a moment, there were almost instantaneous effects, particularly in the financial services sector as a result of the Brexit vote of 2016. In 2020, the UK was the only economy which was downgraded by the International Monetary Fund. The Office of Budget Responsibility, so that's the government's own office, the fiscal watchdog predicted in November that Brexit would shrink the UK economy by 4% in the long run with a free trade agreement. So in other words, a free trade agreement was not as optimal as the single market. It would introduce friction into the system. And in January this year, Amsterdam ousted London for the first time as Europe's top trading hub. So the UK's share of euro-denominated swaps decreased from 40% in July 2020 to 10% in January 2021. And we can also see the impact on the export side. Now, of course, we can factor in COVID and various other things, but we can see that UK-EU exports fell almost 41%, and EU to UK exports fell 29%. UK exports to Ireland declined as well, and to give it more context, so year over year, instead of just accounting for COVID, you can see the figures year over year there, 38 and 16%. UK imports from EU are still over 50% of UK total imports, normally about 53% in January 2021. So, as good old Lenin said, Vladimir, not John, who wins? Give peace a chance. Who wins and who loses? Well, let's start with the fact that there are just a few winners. First, retail. Second, manufacturing. So local manufacturers in some labour sectors might benefit from rules of origin, for example. So Nissan and Toyota operating in the UK may source componentry from within the UK rather than from Asia, for example. So that actually does help UK automotive to some extent, but it's not enough to offset the losses. Foreign exchange, about 30% of global foreign exchange transactions are done in London. Now, it's often been said, and in fact, there were 2 European Court of Justice court cases about it in the early 2010s, where the European Commission tried to stop London, or the UK, from being a euro currency clearing area because the UK was not within the euro area. And the European Court of Justice on 2 occasions found in favour of the British government, because the UK is part of the single market, was part of the market, single market in financial services. But now the UK does not have the Court of Justice as a protector. However, still has Washington, because if the Europeans decided at some point, well, we're going to stop the British banks from doing all this foreign exchange. It's often been said by French finance ministers and so on, we did not invent the euro so that the British could profit on it. Because London does twice as much euro business as Frankfurt and Paris combined. But that is changing, as we're already seeing. Put it this way, if the European Commission said, oh, well, we're not going to let you trade euro anymore, then Washington would say, well, then we're not going to let you trade dollars in Europe. Because Washington obviously wants there to be very free, open, liberal banking systems throughout the world. So let's move on. Financial services. Well, this, of course, is going to be the biggest hit to the British economy, because the UK financial sector has lost its passporting rights. So that includes, of course, every Australian bank that for decades, apart from ANZ, that has headquartered itself in London and has now moved out. And they've had to move out because if you want to do business in Europe, you have to have not just an office with some chap and a few assistants hanging about, you have to establish proper offices, headquarters, European headquarters to qualify for a banking license within the EU. So there's quite a lot that I've been looking at in this respect. And I said some of this to our Tasmanian friends back in 2019. One survey in 2018 found that Brexit had really started happening in 2017. A survey of 275 firms found that by the end of 2017, 100 had shifted operations to Dublin. I don't have to read them all out, you can see them. And this, of course, has proceeded apace as Brexit has progressed, and of course, we've now seen the UK depart. Now, since the referendum of 2016, £1.2 trillion in assets has already been shifted to the EU. 7,600 financial services jobs have already gone to other EU capitals. So predominantly Dublin, but also Luxembourg, Frankfurt, smaller numbers going to Madrid, Amsterdam, Brussels, Paris, Milan as well. Now, to be fair, and as academics, we have to be scrupulously fair, this is a much more optimistic scenario than what was predicted. Some doomsayers were suggesting that 50,000 financial services sector jobs would have gone by this point. They haven't. But firms are still in the process of moving out. Just in the last few weeks, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, for example, in London are moving more staff to the EU, for example, out of London. An Ernst & Young survey in 2021, so just a few weeks ago, found 43% of the 222 they surveyed financial services firms in London had moved or were intending to move to the EU. So this is a work in progress, clearly. Who loses? There are quite a few pages of these, I'm afraid. Now, we shouldn't understate, of course, the significance of the UK financial services sector. It accounts for 7% of GDP, 10% of taxation, as I said, tax haven, I probably meant to, of taxation revenue, or £76 billion per annum. And as we see, the UK banks have lost their single market passporting access. And now, because equivalence, what's called financial equivalence, is granted unilaterally by Brussels to trading partners. So US banks have an equivalence regime, Japanese banks have an equivalence regime, and now UK banks will have an equivalence regime. And of course, the UK will grant equivalent status, their own regime, to European banks operating in the UK. But equivalence is not the same as having a single market in financial services, banking license or passport. It does not, for example, permit lending or deposit services. And to this point, Brussels has only granted temporary equivalence in two areas, derivatives, and secondly, to settle Irish security transactions. But it's a good thing we're speaking today because they did reach a deal last Friday, the EU and UK, on equivalence. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what it is because they haven't published the text yet. That comes out after all the dotted the I's and crossed the T's on the 31st of March or thereabouts. But if you invite me back, or we just sit here and wait for a few days, then we can find out. All right, who loses? Well, there's more. So in January this year, an average 9.2 billion euro in shares per day were traded on Euronext Amsterdam and other Dutch equities traders. So that was a 400% increase upon December 2020. So Amsterdam, as you can see, is looking forward to becoming the #1 financial center in Europe because it's beginning to displace London. So we saw that 6 billion in capital departed London for the EU on the first day of post-Brexit trading. So that was a Friday, 1st of January, not the 13th, but it was the 1st. Investment. Now, one of the things which has made London very attractive to investors, it's because it's a conduit, of course, for foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment, because of London's access to the European single market. That's, of course, why all the Australian banks were there. It's why Switzerland, which is not a member of the EU, but has about 100 bilateral agreements with the EU, utilised its partnership with British banks, like Lloyd's, for example, to get access to the single European market by partnering with British banks. The Swiss, of course, have moved to regularise their passporting access, their financial access to the EU single market. Now, there's possible wins and losses in regard to investment. In the first instance, London, of course, has lost access, but English remains the preferred means by which corporations want to do contracts. So contracts written in English under English law, and I do say English because I'm going to distinguish it from Scottish law. It's an important distinction, as many of you would know. So that's a plus. The other thing is that Britain could, down the track, diverge from the level playing field, which is very important to the EU, and you can see why, and turn Britain, as I think Boris Johnson allegedly threatened at one point, into the Hong Kong or Singapore of Europe. Yeah, the Hong Kong or Singapore of Europe, which would be lightly regulated and would become a massive sort of offshore island, or as a former French Prime Minister used to say, I said as a prisoner, but that would be Nicolas Sarkozy, wouldn't it? But it's true. It's not defamatory. Anyway, I've lost my train of thought now. Okay, so as a former French Prime Minister would say that Britain was an aircraft carrier, a Taiwanese aircraft carrier anchored off the coast of Europe. That was Edith Cresson, in case you were wondering. We don't really hear, I think she died a few years ago, didn't she? Anyway, let's move right on before I get myself into trouble. So we can see just a little graphic here of how Amsterdam is left ahead, but you can also see with the light blue bars how Paris, Frankfurt, Milan have gained on London to some extent since January 2021 in European share trading. A couple of industries we should also see where we're already seeing losses: Honda, Nissan, BMW, Toyota, Jaguar, Land Rover, in the several years after the Brexit referendum, began to implement UK job cuts and plant closures prior to COVID. And we can see in electronics, Dutch Philips closed its only UK plant, and Sony and Panasonic have moved their EU headquarters to Amsterdam. Now, something, of course, the three favourite swear words of the Australian farmer: common agricultural policy. So what will the common agricultural policy, the post-common agricultural policy plans for UK agriculture look like? Well, it's kind of interesting in a way, because I remember some colleagues of mine at Monash and ANU were doing a little thing, we recorded it about 3 weeks before the Brexit vote for Radio National, which I think put it on the day or the night of the Brexit vote. But one of the things which really stood out to me, or two things that stood out to me first before the referendum, was that the North East Farmers Federation, I might have got the name wrong, but in the UK, had taken a neutral position on Brexit and said they weren't instructing their members or advising their members to vote a particular way. But as it turned out, they did vote in the majority for Brexit. We also saw how even farmers in Wales were voting for Brexit, which is, again, a very interesting one, because farmers in the UK can be dependent upon the CAP for their income for between 75% and 95%. Now, people asked me about this at the time, and I said, I very much doubt you'd get an Australian farmer voting like that. I very much doubt an Australian farmer would vote him or herself out of existence like that. So what is the alternative regime which first the May and now the Johnson government have put in place? Well, they only published the paper very late in November 2020. So in other words, until that date, farmers had no idea as to what post-CAP support they could expect past the existing parliament, because Theresa May and Boris Johnson to that point had only guaranteed the subsidisation of farm incomes until the end of the current parliament. So after 2024, the National Farmers Union argues farmers will lose up to 80% of their income in the absence of alternative support. Now, an awful lot is about, land of hope and glory. The farm subsidies will be directed at helping preserve the environment. But it's also true that an awful lot of farmers, both traditional small landholding farmers, will simply go broke. They simply will not be economic anymore. There is a massive distortion which grants large landholders, and for those of you who know your British history, you probably think of the Town and Country Act 1947, which preserves very large swathes of the British countryside for future generations, and long may it be so. However, it also limits the growth of towns, but it leaves also an awful lot of traditional land holdings, sometimes yay unto the Middle Ages, in the hands of large landowners. So we can see that, for example, the beef and sheep industries face unprofitability and very significant decline over this existing decade, so through 2030 in other words. We're already seeing, for example, in the pork industry, the costs and friction associated with cross-border transformation. So in other words, it's becoming too expensive to source British pork. And instead, for example, organic pork farmers, and don't dismiss organic foods, because they are really the innovative and very important and fastest growing market segments in the British agricultural industry, which is going back to my point about Welsh farmers, particularly organic farmers. I could not understand why they were voting against Brexit, because all their innovation subsidies were coming from the Common Agricultural Policy. So some in the pork industry have been forced to switch from UK to Danish pork imports for organic sausages, for example. And one of the reasons for this is that Denmark is remarkably efficient. Remarkable Denmark, that's right, because the government has effectively subsidised a major transition in the pork industry, organic pork in particular, where Denmark, on a fraction of the land, outproduces Germany, for example. So it's an interesting little case study there. Before we get stuck on pork, let's keep moving on. Who else loses in agriculture? Well, taxpayers will stop paying farmers on the size of their farms by 2029. It's about £233 per hectare, comprising a third of farm incomes at the moment. What farms are expected to do by 2028 is to be sustainable businesses, which suggests to me that there'll be an end to direct subsidies. So there are threats of arable degradation, ecological decline, further exacerbation of climate crisis, and this will result in the plan redirecting present subsidies to public goods. And what that means is to environmental preservation, because farms are gone, they won't be there to preserve that land anymore. So the government will be directing subsidies to the preservation of the countryside, which you can see on a train. Plans will direct funds to farm startups, yes, just as the Common Agricultural Policy does, and business diversification plus productivity. And there's really a large question mark I have here. Will this be enough to sustain UK farming? So just a little table, a couple of tables. I don't propose to go through all of it, but the last thing I thought I would do, because we end up over here in Australia, is to look at the trade outcomes of Brexit and negotiations in progress. So the UK has signed 36 agreements at present with external partners all around the world. You'll see in that third row there, the bilateral agreements. This is not all of them, obviously, but just some of the more important partners: Canada, Israel, Japan, a joint one with Norway, Iceland, because they're not members of the EU, of course, Singapore, South Korea, Switzerland, and there was a provisional one in force with Turkey at the moment. But I just want to make the point, looking at the other two rows, that as long as there is some skepticism on the part of the European Parliament, and this has risen on a couple of occasions now, as the UK government controversially sought to write a single market bill some months ago, which purported, or at least no, it set out quite deliberately to break the rule of law. So therefore, Britain would be in violation of its international treaty agreements. The EU wants to ensure that the UK does not feel incentivized to break international law or break its agreements once it's achieved what it wants, such as the ratification of the EU-UK Free Trade Agreement. All right, so I'll move on to look at, this is what would happen though, hypothetically. It is, let me just say, a no deal scenario is plausible, but very unlikely, very unlikely. But this is what it would look like. There would be WTO tariffs apply. And so this default position, so the UK and the EU would default to WTO tariffs, would be a suboptimal outcome. It would be much less workable than the current free trade agreement. And we also see, of course, that the UK is undertaking a number of trade negotiations. And of course, here the AIIA has been instrumental in sponsoring the Australia-EU free trade negotiations as far as the high-level consultation group was concerned a few years ago. And we can see that there are current negotiations taking place with the UK and Australia, New Zealand, United States, and Britain has applied to join what you would probably know better as the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the Comprehensive Partnership for the TPP without the United States, which withdrew under Trump, of course, but is probably going to go back under Biden. A free trade agreement with India, which would be a big win. There's nothing with China at the moment that I'm aware of, but there is one in the works with Taiwan. But because Britain's been making a lot of noise about Hong Kong human rights, which they should be, Beijing could make a lot of trouble about a potential FTA with Taiwan, so it could place obstacles in the way. Joining the CPTPP would give Britain more access to European markets. Australia would probably welcome it. I'm not so sure about other members in the TPP, though, if the US is coming back as well, and they would probably see it as being dominated by the United States and Britain, but that's just one to watch. Well, what about the United States? Well, Joe Biden made his comments about Mr. Johnson very clear prior to his election, so I don't have to repeat them for you because I can tell you know what they are. Richard Neal, who chairs the US Congress's Ways and Means Committee, very powerful committee, won't get a trade agreement without its agreement. The UK government cannot continue to delay the customs border checks between Northern Ireland and the UK. What has happened at the moment, just to give you the current update, is that by 1st of April, they're meant to have ended that grace period. That means that the UK is not currently doing the customs formalities. There's a grace period through 1st of April to allow transition to take place. But after 1st of April, the EU will claim that the UK is in breach of international law, that it's in breach of its treaty obligations. The EU has already started preparing a legal case against the UK. And while that case persists, is why the European Parliament will not ratify at this moment the free trade agreement. Now, Joe Biden has also made it plain that the UK cannot violate the Good Friday Agreement, cannot put a hard border in Ireland. And Mr. Neal's view reinforces and reiterates positions which have already been publicly adopted by both Biden and Speaker Pelosi. And irrespective of whether Trump or Biden, I mean, obviously Trump won it, but won the election of 2020, the UK was never going to be given a sweetheart deal. I don't think Trump really does sweetheart deals, does he? But I like to say I'm probably being a little bit political here by saying at least Peter Navarro is no longer in office. For those of us who know who Peter Navarro is, he was Trump's trade advisor. Trump famously, there's a picture in Bob Woodward's book, it's beautiful, took a picture of what he'd written on his blotter, whatever we call a notepad these days. And Trump had written, "Trade is wrong." Sorry, I got that wrong. No, it's wrong. He wrote, "Trade is bad." So he wrote, "Trade is bad," which I guess amounts to the same thing. But It's somewhat surprising when an American president can write trade is bad on their blotter, you know, because he's been told to, you know, how bad trade is. Now, so what would a UK-US free trade agreement look like? Well, I don't see any reason why the US Trade Representative's office is going to be any nicer under Biden to the UK than it would be under Trump, because the USTR's job is to, of course, get the best deal it possibly can for the United States. And this is where all that stuff, which is not really mythical, about chlorinated chicken coming into the UK could take place. So phytosanitary requirements, hormone controls, tariffs, quotas could likely all disappear under a US-UK free trade agreement. Now, I know that in recent months, since COVID anyway, that Boris Johnson has tried to ring fence the NHS, but I'll tell you a very short little thing. When TTIP, some of you might remember, was being negotiated, that's the transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the mega regional free trade agreement between the US and EU was being negotiated under Obama. Britain had the chance to redline the National Health Service in its negotiation documents. It didn't. It didn't. So in other words, if TTIP had happened, then US pharmaceutical firms could essentially charge what they want, but also effectively you would probably see the privatization of the NHS. So Britain had the opportunity to say, no, NHS, public health, off the table in TTIP. It didn't. So I think that's kind of instructive. Now, I know that past behavior doesn't guarantee future performance, but it can still mean that NHS might be always partially up for grabs in the future. For those of you who watched the TPP take place under Obama 2014-15, you know how much the US pharmaceutical lobbies went for that, and it took Australia standing up to the United States to actually stop them from putting particular intellectual property ring fences around biologics and the length of protection of generic drugs and all that sort of thing. Okay, so, but don't get me started. So I know that Elsa is going to tell me to shut up shortly anyway. So what do I think? Well, I think, how many minutes have I got, Alice? I've got a couple of minutes. Okay. Don't encourage me. My students are always say, he never finishes his lectures. There are too many slides. Anyway, okay. So the way I see it is that by dealing itself out of the EU, where Britain, of course, is very tightly integrated into the EU automotive market, it's likely that the UK would be compelled to integrate its supply chain with NAFTA, or as since Trump has renegotiated it, but it's 98% the same text, the USMCA agreement. Okay, that's the new NAFTA. So UK workers, instead of competing under the social chapter of the EU, which of course guaranteed things like paternity leave, maternity leave, sick leave for casual workers, part-time workers, and so on and so forth, would, under an FTA, have to compete with the consequences of dealing with the Mexican labour market model. What a project I'm doing at the moment actually concerns virtual migration. We call it offshoring, but it's more than that. It's about people being able to do jobs without leaving their living room, but they're effectively working in Australia or in the EU or in the United States. So we call it virtual migration. We don't have time to talk about it here, but you can also see the direct competition, the wage crushing impact of the NAFTA model, because that's what NAFTA was all about. It was all about offshoring and reducing blue-collar wages so that white-collar wages would rise. Okay, that was the Clinton model, and it's still a model today. So, all the way with the USA, well, Johnson said he wanted a UK EU FTA by December 2020. He got one. He got this minimalist or thin agreement. It excludes free movement of labour, but as we can see with the lack of ratification by the EP, there's still a possibility of a hard Brexit. Fishing for financial services agreement, well, that didn't happen. There was talk about horse trading there. I might move on from that because it's getting a bit dated. Let's talk about Australia, because I know that we want to finish and it's much more fun to have a discussion than hear me talking. So implications for Australia. Well, I'll give you a little preview. This is something that I wrote, which is meant to be out in December, but due to COVID has been delayed. So I'll give you the sneak peek. So I'll have to read bits of it though, I'm afraid, because I'm just not that good at memorizing things. So a US-UK free trade agreement would make Australia's two negotiations, so we've got two negotiations, the UK and EU, of course, our free trade agreements which are being negotiated, even more complex. A London-Washington agreement could adversely affect the chances of Australia securing improved access to the UK food markets. Anybody here, and I'm sure there are many of you, has had anything to do with the Trade Committee of Federal Parliament will know that it's all about from farm to plate and how do we get more Australian food into British dinner tables. Right, okay. So this leaves Canberra in an unpredictable position amidst the uncertainty surrounding the level of single market access down the track, because I think that in the next decade, Brexit is not ended, it's not over, it's an ongoing process. And I think political parties will campaign to get a better deal over the next 10 years and more with the EU. So we won't know what levels of single market access London might obtain from the EU in 2025 or in 2030 or beyond. A US-UK free trade agreement is also likely to amplify trade and investment diversion to Australia's disadvantage. In other words, London gets more enamored of doing more business with New York and the United States and with NAFTA than it does with, say, Australia. So that means investment diversion, less foreign portfolio investment, which basically loads up the Australian stock exchanges. You know about this. The second biggest source of Australian foreign portfolio investment is, of course, the UK. An enormous amount of money, and it also provides those pools of capital that we all use to borrow from, to buy houses and cars and all those sorts of things. So this, as I said, this means uncertainty for Australian firms which have traditionally utilised the UK as an EU operations base, so what the relationship is going to be in the future, and have experienced since the Brexit vote. So the final point is the optimum outcome, which can't happen now, of course. When Australia started negotiating the EU free trade agreement, Britain was still a member of the EU before the referendum, when we had the pre-negotiation discussions. So the best outcome for Australia was the status quo, that Britain remain within the EU, Australian banks remain in London, and so on and so forth. But the Brexit referendum has compelled successive British governments to adopt a strategy that would affect a UK withdrawal from the world's most economically integrated region with insufficient substitute market access regimes in place. I've said this at every Brexit paper I've given, and there've been a few. The lessons of Brexit are already clear. No country has ever exited a free trade agreement, reduced its market access, and increased its prosperity as a result. Thanks very much.
There we go. Well, thanks, Larry. I'm going to just pitch in one, and then if you've got a question in the audience, please put your hand up, and Ashley will bring the microphone. But just to start off, in the early stages, it was said that the UK had been so reliant on Brussels for so long making decisions. They didn't have enough of their own trade negotiators, and they were having to borrow from Australia and New Zealand, yes, Canada. I mean, is that to the extent? How has that played out, given their announcement of negotiate free trade agreements with some of those particular countries?
Well, they do have Tony Abbott on side, so everything's going swimmingly. That was quite true. One of my former students actually was one of the people seconded to London to help the UK government on this point. And the reason was, of course, in the first phase of Brexit, when Theresa May was Prime Minister, that they started getting rid of their EU ambassador, and they got rid of all the people, the trade people who were, you know, the British reps who were based in Brussels. And the reason was that the government, the Conservative government, didn't trust them. They thought they'd gone native, and they thought that, yes, a Sir Humphreyism, you know, they thought they'd gone native, and they thought that they were too pro-EU and that they would not serve Britain's interests in doing so. How, I haven't heard, I mean, again, if we stand here until 6 o'clock on Wednesday night, the DFAT is doing a briefing on the EU-Australia Free Trade Agreement, so I could probably ask them then. But I haven't seen any specific evidence that it's affected Australia-UK or Australia-EU trade.
Thank you, Rémy. First of all, a comment. I love reading surveys 3 years after they've been issued. You've used a lot here. I look forward to reflecting on those in 3 years' time, because things do change quite a lot. The question that I've really got is that without Britain in the fold, there's no balance between Germany and France. And it seems to me that France is more intent on distribution of wealth, whereas Germany is more intent on creation of wealth. How's that going to change the trade pact of Europe, please?
Yes, thanks. It's a very important question. I should have said I don't take hard questions, because I'm seeing Linda Reynolds, cardiologist, at the moment, and they've told me that I may have to leave at any second. I think maybe that during the Eurozone crisis, so going back a few years now, the balance of power as it was between Paris and Berlin shifted irrevocably. I think that if you looked at it, then you saw French presidents reading out Chancellor Merkel's press release. So I think that the balance of financial power and thus political power shifted during the Eurozone crisis. So I don't think Britain changed that. Having said that, I think French governments have realized, and French decision makers have realized, that over the last decade in particular, that French power has waned, and certainly it's been on the wane since 1970, when Germany became the world's third biggest economy and displaced France. I think that there's been tacit recognition of this in French political circles, and their strategic response has been to try to bind Germany more closely to EU objectives, and that means whether it's foreign affairs and defence, or whether it's anything else, that French governments, while they might not have given up balancing or influencing Germany, but I think in fact the post-Brexit partnership makes French decision makers and French elites realise that they need to bind Germany more closely to the EU. One of the things that came up, again, going back to economics, in, I think it was 2015, but a couple of years before that, Germany started selling more and more outside the EU than it did within. So in other words, it was selling more to China than it was to France. By 2013, I think it was. So as opposed to this interdependency, which Germans and French leaders had grown up with, and French and German people had grown up with for 50, 60 years, suddenly Germany was looking outside the EU. So it became contingent upon French governments to try and keep, rather than that old thing about NATO keeping the Russians out and the Germans down, it was about keeping the Russians down and the Germans in.
Thank you. I'm just going to jump in with a quick one from the Zoom audience, leading on a little bit. You talked about Amsterdam leading the field in financial services. Apart from the fact that the Dutch, I suppose, speak excellent English, what are Amsterdam's advantages putting them in that leading position?
The Netherlands certainly has a very open and liberal market framework. The language, of course, is important. The proximity to the UK is very important. It's interesting too, just, I mean, it's a kind of sidebar to this, but the Netherlands has a very pro-EU population. And most candidates will run a pro-EU line, that it's good for the Netherlands to be a pro-EU partner, that it's good economically, it's good politics to do so. And that we can already see the advantages of this, that Amsterdam and the Netherlands are gaining from all this. But it's also important, I suppose, that the Netherlands is also, despite its relatively small size, has always been a big contributor, and there's been a few studies on this, to how the financial rules are made in the EU. In other words, the Netherlands punches above its weight because it's a big financial centre. And as many of you will know, of course, there's an awful lot of investment that comes from the Netherlands into Australia as well.
Zara Kinson from the AIIA. I'm interested in the internal situation in the UK moving forward with both Northern Ireland and Scotland. How do you see it dealing with the instability that's going to happen over the next coming years, and even the long-term situation where both Scotland and Northern Ireland, particularly Scotland, might vote to leave, and with Ireland, there might be a push to unite the island there. So do you think this will have adverse effects on the UK?
Yeah, it's a very important question. I think I'm not going to, for a second, hold myself up as an expert on Scottish and Irish politics. I'm just not. But just my layperson's observations is that probably the next 12 months or so in how the Northern Ireland effectively being still part of the EU under the EU customs territory, how that works out, whether that's turns out to be a relatively smooth process or whether it's disruptive, will probably have an impact on how both the Irish and both the North and South feel about that. Scotland, well, my understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, but Westminster would have to give assent to another referendum, wouldn't they? So at least within the current government, I can't see that happening despite the calls. So,
well, Alex Salmond, the former, he's formed a new party.
Yes. Yeah. But as I say, I think maybe within the term of the current parliament or the current government, I can see some instability, but I can't see separatism at this point. But it's certainly revisiting the Scottish referendum is down the track is probably fairly likely, I would have thought.
Do you see Brexit as a temporary divorce, that inevitable that the UK, whether it be 10, 15, 20 years' time, will just be forced to join the EU, or at least try to join the EU again?
Very good question. Very good question. I don't know about force, but one of the things that, because I did my PhD in the previous century, in the 20th century, on the single market. And one of the things that struck me in terms of patterns was that countries applied for EU membership when they're in trouble. And so Britain applied when it was in trouble in the early 60s and again in 67 and ultimately coming in the early 70s. Norway applied a few times too. And Norway was in trouble. But every time it got into trouble, it discovered more fish and more oil. And by the time, because Norway has to have, which are related, fish oil, of course, but by the time the referendum, because Norway has to have a referendum on these kinds of things to join an international organization, came about, the Norwegians had become rich again and didn't want to join the EU. And they haven't asked since. So this happened about 3 times. So I think it's a good question, because I think Britain would need to be in a poor economic state for them to contemplate, for any mainstream political party to contemplate running that line. Okay, other than the Liberal Democrats, who probably aren't mainstream anymore.
Thank you for your talk. Romans called English refugees Albion, which
so did Napoleon.
Which roughly translates as sneaky buggers. I can't imagine how British would go through this path that would not benefit them in some way, either strategically or in the long term. Any care to comment?
I don't think it's very strategic, and I think states can behave irrationally. They can behave foolishly. I mean, we can see even the impacts of good policy, well thought out policy, well-meaning policy, implemented badly, ends negatively for everybody. But when you actually have political parties, and I include the British Labour Party in this, becoming so fearful of voters that they're afraid to lead, that they say, okay, we'll do something which is demonstrably not in our national interest. We'll do that. And we'll muddle through and we'll try to make the best of a bad lot. I don't call that a political strategy. I call that a political accident waiting to happen. And I think that's what's happened. And it's almost as if, you know, British politicians almost forgot their pragmatism for a moment. They forgot their realism. And they've embarked on the good ship Britannia for global Britain. It reminds me of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And those of you who remember that film, and I'm sure most of you do, will know that the film is actually an allegory of the common agricultural policy in Britain going into the EU. And the Holy Grail is the EU, but the French are already on British territory and they're throwing cows at them.
Thank you very much for your talk and all the discussion. We shouldn't really laugh because it can happen to any country like Australia as well. Out of all of this, okay, how does it actually play into our hands in terms of Australia and our trade policies? Whether you think it does play into our hands or not, and how does it affect our position in relation to our relationship with China and Russia, because they are also other emerging powers.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I think it is to Australia's advantage. I think Britain is ready to sign FTAs which might have little economic value. I mean, obviously, Australia will have more economic value, but it's signed a couple of dozen which have little economic value but have political announcement value. Australia will benefit, I think, because we will get more food into Britain, and that's the ultimate aim. And it was certainly the view of the Trade Committee about getting. They were sort of moderately optimistic, I suppose, because that's the real win for us. That's the real win. And if the Chinese aren't going to drink our wine for 5 years, then there've got to be some very drunk Britons about to soak up the surplus. So we should start a campaign now, I think. Drink as much Australian wine as you want. That's the. So I think, yes, I mean, in all seriousness, I think it is to our advantage. What Britain would get out of Australia is not a great deal because we already have a very open and liberal economy. So what are the British going to get out of it? They're already the biggest owners of farmland, I think, last time I looked. There's nothing they can't buy or invest in that they can already do. So I don't see a lot of mileage for the UK, but I see Australia, where Britain imports 50% of its food, getting a share of the agricultural imports. On Russia and China, sorry, I missed the last part of the question there, as it relates to Australia.
Does it also help our hands in any shape or manner with our relationship with China?
I'm not sure that it does. I'm not sure it does. I think it's a separate dispute. Maybe for another paper. Well, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think on that, Rémy, it brings us neatly to the end of our allotted hour. So thank you for audience attention here. Thank you very much for the Zoom audience for engagement and questions. We used to say, you know, Brexit, like Trump, for an institute like us, is the gift that keeps on giving. We can keep running talk. I suspect this won't be the final one either. Rémy, thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you, Zoom audience, and tune in for the next one.